and I'm going to tell you a little bit about tonight's speaker. So tonight's speaker is Melissa Barker, uh, fondly known as the Archives Lady, for those of you who are really into the genealogy community and read a lot of blogs. She's the Certified Archives Manager and Public Historian at the Houston County, Tennessee Archives. She lectures, she teaches, she writes about genealogy research processes. She writes about researching in archives and records preservation. Her blog is actually pretty popular. I'm a fan of it. It's called A Genealogist in the Archives. She has been a professional genealogist for about 17 years, but she's been researching her own history for about 32 years. So she is a phenomenal resource. I'm super excited to have her.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Welcome everyone to the presentation tonight. While I get things set up, I will let you know that, as I told Elizabeth, I'm just getting over a cold, so I'll try my best not to cough without muting. If I'm gone for an extra second as normal, then I'm either coughing or taking a drink. So we're going to get started talking about preserving your ancestors' textiles and handmade treasures. I have been an archivist for the past 10 years, and one of the questions I get all the time is about how to preserve certain kinds of textiles. And so this presentation is something that anyone can actually follow and can actually help you with preserving those textiles. You're going to see a lot of photographs and examples in my presentation because what I like to talk about. I like to show people what I'm talking about. And so these two pictures here, the one on the left is actually a photo that was taken when I was attending the Archives Institute to become an archivist. And the pair of hands that you see there, gloved hands, are mine. We are actually in this photograph working on the Tennessee Supreme Court records, which was phenomenal to get to do. The photograph there on the right is, of course, a silk wedding dress. So we're going to be talking about textiles. First and foremost, let's first talk about genealogists being home archivists. Have you ever thought about yourself as being an archivist yourself? Genealogists and home archivists have a lot of things in common. Some of the things that we have in common is that we both collect old records. Archivists collect those old records in an archive setting, and genealogists, we collect those old records as well, whether we inherit them or whether we're given them from cousins, aunts, uncles, our parents, grandparents. We collect old records as genealogists. I am the genealogist, family historian for my family, and a lot of times there's usually only one of those in a family, and we end up with all the records. One day I got a box in the mail, and the box was from my cousin, and there was a letter inside that said, here, you need all of this. You're the person who takes it all for our family. And it was filled with photographs and documents from our family. So if you're one of those that gets everything, you're just like an archivist, and you should call yourself a home archivist. Another thing that genealogists and archivists have in common is that we try to preserve those records, photographs, textiles, and artifacts for our future generations and descendants to enjoy. Hopefully we are sharing this with our family members, especially our younger family members, because we really want to get someone excited about it so that they'll take over the job when you're no longer there. And so genealogists and archivists like to preserve these things, and we need to know how to preserve our records so that they do last. Another way that genealogists and archivists are the same, we share that information that are on our records, share those photographs, share those handmade textiles with other family members and with other genealogists. Archivists do the same thing. That's what we're in the business to do, is to share the records that we have in our archives with genealogists and other researchers. And so this is just another way that we have some of the same things in common. And last but not least, genealogists and archivists love to tell the stories that are in those records. I know as an archivist that I will run across a photograph or a document that makes me stop in my tracks and want to do research to figure out what's the rest of the story. And then I want to tell someone about it. And as a genealogist, I do the same thing. When I find new information about my family, I want to share it with other family members as well as other genealogists. So this is just some of the few things that we have in common with archivists. And so tonight we're going to talk about these things. We're going to talk about a dedicated working space. Then we're going to talk about not all textiles are the same. So we're going to talk about different kinds of textiles. Handling textiles, how we should do that. Displaying textiles, whether we should or shouldn't, and how to do that. We're going to talk about cleaning and mending textiles. And then how we house these textiles, how we store them. And then the storage and climate controls, which are extremely important. And then when we get down to the end, we're going to talk about consulting with the conservator, because that's something you may need to do, and talk about some handmade treasures. So we got a lot to get to. So let's get started with a dedicated working space. I actually encourage genealogists, whether you're working on your genealogy research or whether you're working on records preservation, that you try to have a dedicated working space wherever you are. Now, not all of us can live in an archive, of course, but we can have that space in our homes. Now, I'm lucky enough to have a separate office in my home, and so I get to do my genealogy in that office. And I also get to work on my records preservation. But you may not have an extra room per se. And so what you could do is you can have that dedicated space. Could be the dining room table. It could be the bed in a extra bedroom. Wherever you are going to be working on your genealogy research and working on records preservation, I encourage you to have a dedicated working space. Now, this photo here is one of our previous volunteers, Miss Ann Sykes. And in the archive setting, we have dedicated spaces for each of our volunteers. That's their space. They have their tools that they need to work with, whatever they're working on at that space, and the records they're working on are in that space. There's reasons we want to have a dedicated working space. One of the reasons is because it allows you to focus on the specific items that are in front of you, whether that's genealogy research or it's records preservation or working on textiles. So that's one of the main reasons why we want to have that specific space. Also, having a dedicated working space will keep you from putting items in danger. Now, what do I mean by that? If you have a dedicated space, it's not mixed up in other things, and you may not get something spilled on your textiles, or you may not get something on that document or on that photograph. It keeps you from having something come in contact with those items to get damaged. And I also like to point out that it's also a great place to have a working space so that you don't get things mixed up that don't need to be mixed up together. So a great dedicated working space is always a good thing. Also, this is a great place to have your archival materials at the ready. When I say archival materials, that is archival folders, archival boxes, archival tissue paper. We're going to talk about some archival tissue paper today. So this is where you're going to have all those materials in that space so that you know where they're at and you can reach for them when you need them. One thing I encourage people to do, and this is what we do in the archives, I'm very adamant about this with my volunteers, is at the end of the day or at the end of the time when you have done working on your genealogy or you're done working on records preservation, clean up your space. Now, this is great for two reasons. First of all, when you clean up your space, you may find that you forgot to put something away. You may have found that you didn't pick up all of the photographs or all of the documents. So that's great. But the secondly, and what I find helps for my volunteers is that if you clean up your space, when you come back to it, when you're ready to work again, your space is cleaned up. I find that if you have to come back to your space and you have to clean it up first before you get back to work, you're not as likely to want to get back to work. So let's clean up our spaces at the end of the day or at the end of the work time so that when you come back to it, you are ready to go and get right back in there. So let's talk about some textiles. Not all textiles are the same, and I obviously cannot tell you about every single textile that's out there in this presentation, but we're going to talk about a few. There are different kinds of textiles made from different kinds of materials. I think we all know that. And so sometimes these textiles have to be treated differently when you're doing preservation. One of the first textiles I want to talk about is cotton. Cotton is very robust. It's very forgiving. It is very sturdy. And so cotton may be something that you run across a lot. So here are some examples. These are handmade cotton dresses that were made by Cliff Anna Wright in the 1940s. Cliff Anna Wright was a young girl here locally where I live. She graduated in 1952. Not too soon after she graduated, she suddenly died. But all of her scrapbooks, her schoolwork, these two dresses, a lot of the things that she had were actually saved by her best friend. And then just a couple of years ago, they were donated to our archives. So these are two handmade dresses, and they're made of cotton. And so we are archiving them in our archives. This is a cotton christening gown. You may have something like this in your collection. We're going to get to the nuts and bolts about how to preserve this. For right now, I'm just showing you some examples. You may have this christening gown that you are wondering, how should I preserve this so that it doesn't yellow? And so it doesn't get damaged, and it can be used maybe for my grandchild, my great-grandchild in the future. The next type of textile I want to tell you about is linen. Linen obviously is different from cotton. Many textiles have been made from linen, and it's something that you may have pieces of in your collection, such as vintage linen napkins that have been cross-stitched on or maybe embroidered on. I know I have some from my grandmother. This was something that was very popular to do. These here in the photograph are from the 1940s. And it was something very popular and something that was handed down to other family members or given as gifts, such as a wedding gift or an engagement gift, things like that. So vintage linen napkins, if you have these in your collection, I'm going to show you here in a minute how we need to preserve them. This is a linen tablecloth. This was made by my mother, and it's a very large tablecloth. And she made this out of linen thread. It's very beautiful, but it's also something that needs to be preserved correctly. And so you may have something like this, maybe a linen doily that was made by your grandmother. The next type of textile is wool. Wool is also a very robust textile. It's also something that's very sturdy, very hardy, but it's something that is very susceptible to damage. And so we need to make sure we take care of that. Many of you may know about wool letterman's jackets from when you were in school or your parents were in school. These are from 1966. This particular one, it was donated to our archive, and it is all wool. The parts of it are leather, where the little white stripes are on the shoulders. So that's leather. So it's something else you have to consider. But majority of this jacket is wool. Thankfully, there's only a couple of moth holes in this jacket, but for the most part, it's in very good condition. And it really was only hung up by a hanger in a closet. So we're very fortunate that it isn't even more damaged. This is a wonderful item we have in our archives. This is a wool army blanket from 1941. We believe that this blanket was never used with the Army. It was probably something that had been in a storehouse, but it was donated to us. And when you touch it, you can tell that it's wool because it's very, very rough feeling, very scratchy. If you've ever touched some wool can be very scratchy to your skin, but it's something that we've had to preserve. The next type of textile is silk. I showed you that silk wedding dress on the very front slide of this presentation, but silk can be very, very delicate. And if you have something that is made of silk, you'll want to take care of it properly. Here is a French embroidered silk handkerchief, and you may have something like this in your collection that you've been handed down from your grandparents, aunts, or uncles. And so silk is something that we really need to pay closer attention to because it can be more delicate and more susceptible to damage. And again, here's that silk wedding dress. This is from 1908. It was on display at an archive. You may have this in a box. It may be very precious to you, and maybe you want it to be used by one of your grandchildren or great-grandchildren. And so if you do, then we want to preserve it correctly so it can be used or just to be preserved because it was in the family for so many years. Now, the next type of textile you may or may have thought of, may not have thought of, is synthetics. Synthetics is something that is more recent, and when I say recent, within the last 50 to 75 years, synthetics. And we have materials that we have in our collections made of synthetics. And so this is what I mean by synthetics. If anybody remembers Saturday Night Fever, John Travolta's polyester suit. Any of us that grew up in the 70s know about polyester. I remember in the 70s, that was all that there was, and that's what you had to wear. And so I kind of have an aversion to polyester these days. It's not something that I want to wear. But polyester was a synthetic textile, and it's going to be in your collections. Many of our clothing, many other things have been made with polyester and other type of synthetics. And so you'll need to know how to preserve those things. Here's another example. This is actually a quilt that was pieced together with polyester pieces. And so it's not something that I would want to sleep under, but you may have something like this. Our parents, grandparents, and aunts and uncles, those that made quilts. My mother was a quilt maker, took those synthetic pieces because it was material, it's what they had, and they made quilts out of them. So this one's from the 1970s. I would call this a crazy quilt because it's just, there's no pattern to it. They used all different kinds of synthetic materials. So that's some of the types of textiles that we may come in contact with. Like I said, I could not talk about all of them because there are just so many different kinds, but those are some of the major ones that you will probably have in your collection and one that you would want to take care of. So let's talk about handling textiles. A lot of people think that you can't handle them, that they're too delicate. And in a lot of cases, we really do need to pay attention to how we handle our textiles. But it's important that we use some good common sense. So we want to handle our textiles gently, even if it's cotton or wool or one of those textiles that is very thick or very sturdy. We still need to pay attention to how we handle those textiles and handle them gently. We want to use both hands to support those textiles because they may not look fragile, but they could be fragile. And so we want to make sure that we give those textiles all the support that we can when we're looking at them, when we're holding them up. It's important that we give them that kind of support. It may even be that you want to put them on a table or a counter or put them on a bed, something that can support those textiles, because if you hold them incorrectly, you could damage them. You could damage the fibers in the textiles, which could create rips, tears, and other damage, which we do not want to do. Here is a photograph from the George Washington University Museum and Textile Museum. As you can see that they have this particular textile on a large counter. This is what I'm talking about by using support for your textiles. You don't want to hang them up or hang them from something where the weight of its own textile itself could pull on the fibers and actually damage them. So you want to, when you're looking at them, when you're inspecting them, when you're looking at showing them to family members, put them on a table, a bed, or a counter like this to give them that support. This is the question I get all the time about wearing gloves. Should you wear gloves or should you not wear gloves when handling textiles? I can tell you that in the archives world, wearing gloves when you're working with records preservation has been an ongoing back and forth. It's kind of like eggs. You know, 1 year eggs are good for you, the next year eggs are bad for you. And so I think now the archives world has settled on the precept that wearing gloves, you only need to wear gloves when you're handling photographs. For everything else, you don't need to wear gloves. And we've come to this conclusion because when you wear gloves and you're handling delicate documents or delicate textiles, you lose this textile sensation in your fingertips. And when you do that, you cannot feel or you can't tell how you're holding those documents or textiles, which means you may not be able to feel that you're actually holding them in such a way that you're damaging them. So that's why now we say you don't have to wear gloves with documents or textiles or most anything else, but you do need to wear gloves with those photographs. Photographs are different. The oils and dirt on your hands, even if you've washed your hands, can get on the photographs. And over time, the more people that handle those photographs, that dirt can actually damage photographs. So we want to wear gloves with our photographs, but for everything else, it's okay not to wear gloves. So what kind of gloves should you wear when you're wearing gloves? Well, you can get the traditional white cotton gloves, which are fine. They tend to get dirty. And so I usually encourage people to get the cheaper nitrile gloves that are there on the right, and you can get those just about anywhere. If you do use nitrile gloves, I do encourage you to get the powder-free gloves, because the powder that's inside of these gloves, and of course the powder's there to help you put the gloves on, they slip on better, but the powder is not archival quality. So you don't want to get that powder on any of your documents, photographs, or textiles. So get the powder free. And then of course, if you're allergic to latex, they have latex free gloves. But if you use the white cotton gloves or the nitrile, either one's fine. Just make sure and get you a pair or two and have them at that dedicated working space where you work, so that when you need to use them, you can pull them out. This is actually a photograph of me looking at a quilt. As you can see, I have gloves on. I actually put these gloves on out of respect for this quilt. I was called upon to come and inspect this quilt for damage, for dating and things like that. And out of respect, I just wanted to put on the gloves to show others in the room, because it was a group get together. Someone was donating this particular quilt, and I wanted to just show that respect. This is actually a World War I quilt. It is dated 1917. It is a name quilt. As you can see, in one of the corners it says German-American War, April 1917. Of course, that was before it was named World War I. And then it's a name quilt that we counted over 200 names on this quilt that were handwritten. And these were all local veterans of World War I from our area. Some of the writing had actually faded, but we were able to capture all of it. And it is now actually on display at our local city hall. But it is a fantastic, it's actually was a Red Cross fundraiser quilt, and it was a fantastic example of quilt making. So how should we display our quilts? First and foremost, I would say, if you can help it, to not display them. The reason I say that is because sun is extremely damaging to any textile. I always strongly recommend that textiles should not be displayed. But if you strongly feel like you want to display your textiles, I would just suggest you do it very carefully and for a limited amount of time. They should not be framed and hung on the wall. One of the reasons is because if you're going to frame a textile and then hang it, you're actually going to put pressure on that textile from the hanging process. The hanging process will pull on the fibers of the textiles, and I've actually seen textiles that have hung long enough that they have actually come apart because of the hanging process and the weight of that hanging. Also, sunlight. Sunlight is extremely damaging. I have actually seen textiles hang on walls where sunlight has hit the textiles and has literally, if it's colored textile, have literally washed off the color. And so it's important that you pay attention to where you display your textiles. Many of us have handmade quilts, and we put them on our beds, either at the foot of the bed, or maybe you're even using them as covers. If that's what you would want to do and you feel comfortable doing that, then by all means do that. But if you're looking to preserve these quilts for future generations, then I would encourage you not to put them on your bed, because actually using them could actually damage them. And so I would encourage you, if you want to put your quilts out for any reason, like to show family members or to have it on display when you have family get-togethers, put it out for that short time and then put it back away. Tapestries. There are tapestries out there that were meant to be hung on the wall. That's how they were produced. That's how they were meant to be displayed, is hung on the wall. If you're going to do that, I would just encourage you to have them supported properly. I would suggest that you would even consult with the conservator about how to hang those tapestries, especially if they're very old, if they're damaged, or if they're delicate. Talk to a conservator about how to display them if they are meant to be hung on the wall. Here's an example of some displayed items. This is an early sampler. Some of you may have this in your collection. A sampler was done by usually a young school-aged child, teaching them about their schoolwork, but also teaching them how to do needlework. And this one is actually framed, and it actually has a little bit of sunlight that had hit it, and it actually is not as bright colored as it should be. but this is an example of an early 19th century sampler that had been framed. And again, here's an example of a quilt on a bed. Like I said, for limited times, I think it's okay to display a quilt, but for the most part, it should be put away. My mother, again, was a quilter. She made me quilts up until she passed. And we, every so often, will bring out the last one that she made and put it on our bed. But for the most part, we keep it put away. So let's talk about cleaning and mending our textiles. This can be very, very delicate, and it may be something you feel comfortable doing or not feel comfortable doing. First of all, you need to consider the age and condition of your textile before you even think about cleaning or mending it. If your textile is very old, if it's very historical, if you have something that's very historical, not only to your family, but to the local area where it was made, I would also consider that. Also the condition, if you have any rips or tears or any kind of damage whatsoever, I would not try cleaning and mending it yourself. Some textiles are very sturdy, and maybe it's something that you can wash, either hand wash or on a gentle cycle in your washing machine, which I would highly encourage you not to use a washing machine. But first and foremost, I would look at that age and condition of the textile. One of the things that I encourage people to think about is that you may cause more damage, or you may cause new damage to your textile if you try to clean it and you don't do it properly. Not to scare you, but you don't want that to happen. There's nothing worse than you doing some kind of damage to your own historical records or documents or textiles, and then you have to get it fixed. So obviously, if you don't feel comfortable working on it, and if it's something that's very delicate or it's something very historical, I would ask, reach out to a conservator, which I'm going to talk about here in just a minute. If your textile is sturdy and stable, if it's made of good cotton or it's really thick wool, it may be okay for it to be dry cleaned or wash on a gentle cycle and air dry. But I would think about that 1,000 times before I would do it. Most textiles are not prepared to be dry cleaned or washed in that manner, especially if you don't have any experience with it. I would reach out to a textile conservator to ask their opinion on what to do with it. Again, consult with the textile conservator. I'm going to talk to you about how to find those if you're in doubt about cleaning, and especially if you need your textile mended. A lot of textiles, you're going to find that the advice is to just leave it alone. But there are some textiles that can be mended, and you can tell that it hasn't been mended. So you might want to reach out to that conservator. Here's another example of some cotton. This is the flour sack material that was turned into clothing. You may have something like this in your collection. It was extremely popular at the time when these flour sacks, the flour companies made these sacks in such a way that they had used the material. Many people used the material to make clothing. This especially was important during the Depression era. And so it's something that you may have. I have found that these materials are pretty sturdy and can withstand actually washing in the washing machine, but you need to look at it, because if there's any rips or tears whatsoever, if you were to wash that in the washing machine, it would make it worse. Many times my advice is to brush it off and then just store it, like I'm going to tell you about here in a minute. This is an example of an old mending project on a flour sack garment from the 1930s. This is not something that I would encourage you to do today, but this is an example of a mending, an attempt to mend, I think, a hole on a flour sack garment. And while it probably worked and it probably stayed there, it's not something that I would recommend today. Here is some damage on a damaged quilt. I've seen some of my family's quilts that have had this kind of damage. It's from use, and you could probably get it fixed, but also there's a little bit of some history there if it was used. And so sometimes we want to just leave it like it is and store it archivally. So let's talk about housing those textiles. This is where I'm going to tell you about how to store your textiles, what materials to use, and how to store them. We want to store our textiles archivally, and we want to use preservation suppliers that sell the materials we need to house these textiles. For the most part, when it comes to textiles, you're only going to need a couple of 2 or 3 things. You can get those at archival stores, as I'm showing you here on the screen. These are all online. You can actually look at their catalogs online, order online. I would encourage you, though, to get a paper catalog sent to your home through the post office. The reason I tell people to do that is sometimes, for me anyway, it's easier to sit down with a paper catalog and find what I need in the paper catalog and then go online and order it. It's kind of like getting the Sears and Roebuck Christmas catalog every year. I love when my new archival catalogs come in, but for me, it's easier to find it in the catalog and then go to their website and put in the catalog number and order it. So that's just something that I encourage people to do. If you easily can get through those online catalogs and find what you're looking for, fantastic. But these are just a few. Amazon is one of them. They sell archival. A lot of these archival stores sell their products through Amazon. We are going to use a lot of tissue paper with our textiles, and you can get archival tissue paper. Many people don't realize, though, that there are 2 different kinds of archival tissue paper. There is buffered archival tissue paper and unbuffered archival tissue paper. And so what's the difference, and when would you use which one? Well, buffered archival tissue paper is buffered because it contains an alkaline substance. That substance is usually calcium carbonate. It's added as an alkaline reserve or a buffer to counteract acids that may form in the materials. And so it's important to remember that buffered archival tissue paper has an extra buffer in it to help counteract those acids that can be in our textiles. Unbuffered archival tissue paper does not have that alkaline substance. Now, the reason why that's important is because there are some certain textiles that you do not want to use buffered archival tissue paper because that alkaline substance can actually damage your textiles. And so some of those materials that you don't want to use the buffered with is anything that's made from animals, such as silk and wool. Maybe you have a feathered boa, some leather, especially leather, things made with horsehair. Things like that, you do not want to use the buffered archival tissue paper. You definitely want to get the unbuffered. And so that's how I remember it. Anything made from animals, I want to use the unbuffered. So when you're ordering archival tissue paper, looking at it, you're not going to be able to tell the difference because it looks just like the same. The only difference is one has the alkaline substance and the other one doesn't. And so you want to look at the labeling and you want to look at the catalog. And so if your textiles are not made from animals, then you want to get the buffered. If it is made from some sort of an animal textile, then you want to get the unbuffered. But tissue paper is something that we use a lot when we're archiving textiles. Archival boxes. Archival boxes come in all different shapes and sizes. I actually answered a question today from someone who contacted me through my website asking me about boxes. They wanted to put a scrapbook in a box, but they couldn't find a box that was big enough. Well, that's one good reason about getting that paper catalog from the archival store. You can look at the list of the sizes of the boxes. These archival stores make all kinds of boxes, all shapes and sizes. Another good thing about these archival stores is that you can contact them and you can talk to them about the item you want to put in a box, and they can make you a custom box for whatever item that you have. You'll have to pay a little bit more for that, but I think it's worth it when you're trying to archive or archivally put together some sort of a box for your textile or whatever it is that you have. And so talk to them about making a custom box for your material. They actually have boxes for clothing. If you look in their catalogs, you'll see that they have boxes for dresses, for coats. They even have boxes for hats, things like that. So the catalog is a fantastic place to go to look for these archival stores for the boxes. And so you're going to want to get archival boxes and archival tissue paper. And see, they have boxes for hats, even for caps. Like I said, they have a box for just about everything. And then you can also have a custom box made if you have something that is unusually shaped, or you need to archive that is, you just need a special box for. One thing I encourage people to do is if you have a box, or if you order a box and your item that you're putting in the box is a little smaller than what the box is bigger, and it's moving around in the box, just take some of that archival tissue paper and crumple it up and put it inside of the box around your item so that it doesn't move. That's a simple fix. They make boxes for large quilts. This is something that I know that several of the archival stores do. And in fact, I think they're even called quilt boxes. So look for those in the catalog. One thing about when you're archiving or when you're storing quilts or any kind of blankets or anything that you're going to be folding, it's important that you put the archival tissue paper in between the folds. And then every 6 months to a year, you need to bring out those boxes and you need to refold those textiles in a different way, because you don't want creases and you don't want those folds to become permanent in your textiles. And so every 6 months to a year, we bring out our textiles, we take them out of the boxes, we air them out a little bit, we refold them, put those tissue paper where the folds are, and put them back in the box. Also, you want to store your textiles in their boxes flat, or as flat as possible. We don't want to store them on their ends of the boxes, so that if it's a quilt, that quilt may sag in the box and settle at the bottom of the box. You don't want that. You want your textiles to lay as flat as possible. One thing before I leave storing textiles: if you have a garment such as a jacket or a military uniform, something that is right now hanging on a hanger in your closet, I would encourage you to get it out of the closet, get it off the hanger and into an archival box. The hangers can really damage these textiles because you're hanging it. Those fibers are breaking as the weight of itself is hanging on that hanger. And so if you have things on hangers, I would encourage you to get them in archival boxes. So we've talked about housing our textiles. So let's talk about storage and climate controls. Even if you have everything in an archival box, everything with archival tissue paper, if you're not storing them in proper controls, climate controls, that's something you need to look at. We do not want to store anything. I mean, no, we don't want to store documents, photographs, but especially textiles in an attic, basement, garage, an outbuilding, anything like that, because they're not being climate controlled. Also, this is where rodents and bugs can get to them very easily. And believe me, rodents and bugs love to eat textiles. If you've ever found something that's been out in a garage or in a basement or an attic that rodents or bugs have gotten to, and you see the little holes in that wool jacket, you know that moths have gotten to them, or rodents get to them and make their beds out of those textiles. So you don't want to store them, if you can help it, in an attic, basement, or a garage. We want to store our textiles in a very dry environment off of the floor. When I say a dry environment, yes, humidity comes into play, but also anywhere, you don't want to store these anywhere there's water. You don't want to store it like near your hot water tank or anywhere where the water can get to it. And also off the floor. I encourage when my volunteers at the archives at the end of the day when we're leaving to make sure that any boxes of records or anything that they've been working on is not on the floor. They just simply pick it up and put it on the work table. The reason being is because we don't know what's going to happen overnight in the building, just like we don't know what's going to happen overnight in our homes. You may have a water leak of some kind that floods your home. You may have a storm come in overnight that flooding comes in. And so if your items are not on the floor, you stand a better chance of them surviving. We need to store our textiles in the area in our home where the temperatures are consistent and do not fluctuate. You know, I know that not all of us can live in an archive. When you go to an archive and a library, you always have to take that sweater because it's cold. Well, there's a reason it's cold. That's because we keep our temperatures lower because we want to keep the our papers, our photographs, and our textiles from deteriorating. These items are already deteriorating naturally on a daily basis, but if we keep our temperatures low enough, it will slow down that deterioration and they will last longer. And so the most important thing is that you want to find a place in your home, most likely a dark closet would work, that the temperatures in there are consistently the same. What is really damaging to a lot of our documents, photographs, and textiles is when the temperatures fluctuate. The temperatures are very hot and then they become very cold and they keep going back and forth. That's very damaging to our archival materials. And also, I've already mentioned this, we want to keep our textiles out of the direct sunlight. Sunlight is actually one of the more damaging aspects of trying to take care of our records. I have seen people that have framed documents, original documents, and have framed original photographs, put them on their walls, and let the sunlight hit them. What happens is that the writing on those documents have been completely washed off after they've been exposed to sunlight for a certain amount of time. And I've seen images on photographs literally disappear from sunlight. And so we don't want our textiles to come in contact with sunlight because the color will fade and the sunlight really will start yellowing that textile. I understand we want to show off our documents, our photographs, and our textiles, but try to look at when the sun is coming into through the windows and how it hits them if you're putting them on display on a table or hanging them on a wall so that that sunlight does not make any more damage. Climate controls. We've talked about climate controls for just a second, but I want to delve a little bit more deeply into that. This one always gets people. I encourage people to, wherever they're storing their items, to have a steady temperature, somewhere between 35 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, I know not all of us can have our homes at those degrees because that's pretty cold. In the archives world, we keep our back rooms very cold. We wear our own sweaters to have to work in there. But keep it as cool as you possibly can. Store your things, items in the places where it's as cool as possible. And if it's dark, it's cooler. And the main thing is keeping those temperatures consistent. That's what's going to help. Humidity levels. I'm asked all the time about what humidity levels. Now, I live in Tennessee. Humidity here can get pretty high in the summertime. My husband says it's air you can wear. And so if you live in those states where the humidity levels can really get up there, our humidity levels get between 70 to 80% in the summertime, if not higher. And so in the archives, we have dehumidifiers running every single day. In the wintertime, we don't have to empty them very much, but in the summertime, we empty them about every other day. And so we need to keep our humidity levels in our homes or in the storage areas where we store our materials between 30 and 50%. We keep ours in the archives at about 35%. And so the humidity is what you really want to pay attention to, because if they start fluctuating, then you're going to start finding mold and damage on some of your items. So that consistent temperature and humidity level is what you're looking for. The deterioration of your textiles is happening naturally already every day. But if you keep your temperatures and your humidity levels at a consistent temperature and humidity level where they need to be, then those textiles stand a better chance of surviving for generations to come. I would also consider purchasing a temperature and humidity monitor for the area where you're storing your items. We have these in the archives. We check them every single day to make sure that there's no fluctuations. But if you're storing your items in a cool, dark, and dry place, you should be good to go. You don't want to see this. This is mold growing in a damp area. Now, this is a pretty extreme example of that. But if you have boxes of records, photographs, or your textiles stored close to something like this, that mold is going to get on your items, and mold grows. It is a living thing. And so you do not want to get these on your items, because then you have to go through mold remediation, which can be very scary. And so always check the spaces where you're storing anything, but especially your genealogical and archival things, and make sure there's no mold growing. If there is, then you want to remove it immediately and start that mold remediation. But you don't want to find this. So let's mainly keep your temperature and humidity levels where they need to be, and you should not have a problem. Consulting with the conservator. You know, I know that you may not be comfortable with working with your textiles like I've talked about. And believe it or not, in the archives world, we run across things that we're not comfortable with as well. We may not have been taught how to take care of it. So we have to reach out to conservators. If you don't feel comfortable repairing your own textiles, cleaning them, storing them, if you just need more information, I would encourage you to reach out to a textile conservator. If your textiles have extensive damage and you want to get them fixed, or even consult with them to see if that can be fixed, that's another reason to reach out to a textile conservator. If your textiles are rare or extremely historical, one of a kind. Now, when I say extremely historical, to us, all of our textiles, our documents, our photographs are extremely historical, and they're rare to us. But they may not be one of a kind, and they may not be rare or extremely historical to others. And so it's important that if you actually know you have something that is historically significant to your area, to where you live, to the city, county, state where you live, that you get conserved by a conservator, because it's something that is not only important to you and your family, but it's also important to your community. And so it needs to be saved. One of the places you need to look for a local conservator is at the state archives. All 50 US states have a state archives, and almost all of our state archives have a conservator on staff. They even have specific textile conservators, a lot of them do. Now, what may happen is that you can contact them. They may not be able to work on your materials, but they can give you advice, and they can also give you names and contact information of conservators in the area that can help you. Another place to go is the American Institute for Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works. You can go online and find them. They have a section on their website for conservators, and you can find one in the area where you live and contact them. A lot of these people have their own businesses, and so you can contact them and consult with them. They should be able to give you a quote for whatever work needs to be done, but they may even be able to just give you some simple advice on how to handle the problem that you're experiencing. So my last parting advice to you is to do not do anything to your textiles that you can't undo. And so that's our advice when we talk to our volunteers in the archives. When they come to work for us, we show them what to do, what not to do, but try not to do anything to your documents, your photographs, or your textiles that you can't undo. And so with that, I say thank you so much for attending this presentation. Please visit my blog, A Genealogist in the Archives. The link is also in the handout. And you can find me on Facebook. Just search for The Archive Lady and like my page. Here's my email address. Please feel free to email me. I love getting emails from those who have attended my presentations. If you've got questions about researching in archives, Tennessee research, or taking care of your records and textiles, drop me an email. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Elizabeth for any questions that we may have.
Great. Okay, give me 1 second. All right, yeah, that was wonderful. There are many questions that I'm actually super excited to go through them because I want to know the answers myself. Okay, so I'm just gonna kind of go at random, you guys, but if we do not get to your question this evening, definitely send Melissa an email. We have the email right there on the screen for you to just grab. Okay, I'm gonna ask this first question because you were just talking about humidity.
Yes.
Somebody had actually asked, what about low humidity?
Actually, believe it or not, low humidity can actually damage as well. It won't damage textiles, but it will damage things like newspapers, and some particular documents that's made out of the same type of paper as newspapers. What will happen is that actually newspapers and some documents actually need a little bit of humidity.
Yeah.
And what's going to happen is if you have that low humidity, they will become extremely brittle. And when you touch them, they will literally fall apart in your hands.
So this person would like to know how to take care of a silk robe from China from 1904. They also have a cotton quilt from 1910 and a cotton popcorn weave coverlet from 1860. So a
Oh,
couple things are cotton, but then also silk.
yes. The silk, remember me talking about buffered and unbuffered tissue paper. You're going to want to use the buffered with your 2 items that are not made from animals. Your silk is made from an animal, so you want to put that in with the unbuffered. But mainly, archiving textiles is really straightforward. You want to get a box and you want to get archival tissue paper. You want to put those items in your box with the tissue paper. Like I said, if you have to fold the item, then every 6 months to a year, you should bring it back out, refold it a different way so that there's no creases or any kind of permanent folds that are created. And other than that, you need to store it in a cool, dark, dry place. If you bring it out for exhibition or to show family members, just be sure that if it's very delicate, to handle it properly, give it a lot of support, and then put it back in its box and put it away.
Okay, so the next question I see is somebody who said that their grandmother was a quilter, so they have a ton of quilts. And sometime before she died, she embroidered individual squares of birds of America, and she's yet to put them together as a quilt. Her question is that the embroidery thread has bled into the squares, mostly red thread. How do I fix this? Or could you steer me to where I can find info on what to do?
I would encourage you to reach out to a textile conservator on that. Because my initial thought is that there's not a way to fix it. There is probably a way to stop it from going further.
Yeah.
But I would encourage you to reach out to a textile conservator, contact wherever you live. If you live in the United States, contact the state archives where you live. It doesn't have to be where your ancestors were, but and ask to speak to their conservator. You can also get on their website and find the email address for the conservator. Ask them the question. They may give you some advice, or they may give you a name and contact information of a textile conservator that can help you.
Great. So kind of in the same vein of quilts, somebody asked, so quilt racks are not good, right?
No, they're not. The quilts had to, and I'm thinking about the quilt racks that they actually put the quilts on to quilt the quilt. But she's thinking of the quilt
Of
racks
the ones you
probably.
store them.
Well, the ones you put it like at the end of your bed where you can display them. No, because you're hanging the quilt on those quilt racks, and it's actually putting pressure on the fibers of the quilts as it hangs. The actual weight of itself can actually be damaging to it. I would encourage you that if you want to display it, if family members are coming over for something, you could display it for a few hours. It's not going to hurt anything, but I would not display it as on a permanent basis like that.
The picture of the World War II quilt, somebody was wanting to know what kind of lighting was over the quilt.
It's actually being stored, as I said, at our local city hall, and I was consulted with them about lighting. It is UV lighting that is specifically like we use in our displays and exhibits in the archives and museum, and so we have special bulbs for that, and so that's what the kind of lighting that they're using.
I have some cross stitching that my grandmother made in the 1980s. I don't know if that is part of the topic of this presentation. So they're already framed. Okay, so she has this cross stitching that's framed. She already had one reframed, and they use museum glass that's supposed to stop UV rays.
Yes.
But I'm not sure if that's sufficient. They weren't archivists. It was a frame shop.
Well,
I have some others that want to clean and preserve. What are your thoughts?
Actually, a lot of places that do the framing that use the archival glass, that they know what they're doing, and it's right. But I still would be very careful if you're putting them up on walls. Pay attention to when the sunlight comes in the windows. If it's hitting it, I would move it to a different place still. Even though you have that glass in there, you don't want to take any chances.
You also had there are a couple people asking about shadow boxes. Are those okay? Storing, and also framing / displaying like military uniforms. Is there a way of doing that type of stuff in a way that,
There actually is. There is, because if you ever go to a military museum, you see they have
yeah,
them on display. But what you don't realize is that in a museum setting, those, if you have ever noticed, that they have their exhibits for a particular period of time.
right.
Usually exhibit starts on this particular date and it ends on this particular date. And it's usually somewhere within about 3 months at the most, maybe 2 months. The reason being is because they don't want those things on display for that long period of time. They put it on display for a period of time, then they put it back in their box and put it back in the back cool, rooms. And so if you want to use a shadow box or any kind of display boxes, I don't have a problem with that, and I don't think most archivists would have a problem with it. The problem comes whenever you put it on permanent display. If you have it on display like forever, and if it's sunlight's hitting it, or if it's hanging on a wall, and so if it's a textile and it's hanging, over time it's going to discolor, it's going to become damaged. And so there's not a problem with displaying it. I would just say do it for a limited time.
Maybe pull it out for when you're having a family gathering.
Yes, if you're having a
Yeah.
family get together at holidays or birthdays or Father's Day, whatever, Easter, pull things out like that for your family members to see, but then I would pull them right back in and put them away again.
There are a couple of people asking about cedar chests. Are cedar chests okay for storing things? Is that a myth? Is it a good alternative to a box?
It is not a good alternative for a box. You may have found things that were in a cedar chest that are just fine. They made it just fine for those 100 years. But what people don't realize is that wood has chemicals in it. We don't store any of our records or anything on wood shelving in the archives. We use metal shelving. And so we don't use wood. And so it's important that you don't store your things in wood. I would encourage you to get archival boxes. And now you could take those archival boxes that have your materials in them, and then you could put those boxes in your cedar chest. Just don't want your materials to touch the cedar wood.
Yeah, because sometimes those cedar chests, depending on when they were produced, could even be treated on the inside with something. And that could
Absolutely.
off gas even more.
Absolutely.
So there are a couple of people who asked about like fur or things like sealskin coats. I think, I
Yes.
did see something about sealskin coats in here.
Just remember what I said about buffered and unbuffered archival tissue paper. With anything made from animals, you want to use the unbuffered tissue paper. And then you want to use an archival box and just use the instructions like I talked about. Try to store it as flat as possible, but if it's something you have to fold, put that archival tissue paper in between the folds and then bring it out every so often to refold it.
So one person had said that they have an old tattered captured during this flag. It was a flag that was captured during the Civil War. It's currently in a plastic bag, then laid flat in a box. It's completely twisted and crumpled, but we're too afraid to uncrumple it. Would you recommend getting a conservator to help flatten it out or just leave it alone? And the same person asked like an additional question right below it. What about ironing textiles? Probably not. She's not referring to that, but maybe just a general question about ironing textiles.
Ironing, let's take the second one first. Ironing textiles. I would not encourage ironing textiles, mainly because if you're not trained in handling textiles, you could get your iron too hot, not paying attention. So I would not. But as far as that Civil War flag, yes, I would reach out to a conservator, and I would also reach out if you know what battle it came from, because then you could reach out to an archive, a Civil War archive or the state archives where that battle took place. I think they would probably be very interested in seeing it, knowing about it. And if it's something very important to their history, they may even help you conserve it.
And there was a question in here about what type of organizations exist that you can maybe donate textiles like quilts and Italian linen and hand-embroidered items to, just like to donate for preservation purposes.
Absolutely. I think that if you'll get online and just Google textile museums, or a museum where the textile came from, I think you would be very surprised by what you can find. There are many textile museums and textile archives out there.
Just me Googling American Quilt Museum, there is a National Quilt
Absolutely.
Museum.
Yes, there is.
Yeah.
I like
So
to say there's an archives for everything and a museum for everything.
yeah.
So if you just get out there and Google, and again, I point people to state archives all the time because they have a lot of information. So I would contact them, let them know what you have. Maybe they're interested in it. And if not, they may give you some advice on an archive or a museum that they can point you to.
Great. So we are running a little bit low on time, but I think we have time for 2 quick questions. But if we did not get to all of your questions, which I see that there are 25 of them in the Q&A, some of which you did already answer, Melissa, and I just didn't mark them. But definitely reach out to Melissa, send her an email, and ask her if we didn't get to your question. So first question, how to preserve Native American baskets, like the hand-woven baskets?
Yes, yes, the same thing. I would suggest you get a large box to put it in. And I would also put some archival tissue in that box so it does not move around. That's usually how things mainly get damaged, is that they move around in the box from when people move them from one shelf to another or something like that. But that's how I would do that. Like I said, a lot of our archiving principles are very straightforward.
Great. And the last question, how do you know if dry cleaning is truly safe?
You don't, because you don't know which dry cleaning business is good to go with. My philosophy is that I don't use dry cleaners. I either just leave it alone like it is. Right now, I've got a World War I military uniform jacket that has just been donated to our archive, and I'm leaving it alone. I will just put it in a box with archival tissue paper just as it is. Yes, it's a little dirty. I've brushed it off with some brushes, and I've tried to clean it up as best I can, as delicately as I can. But for the most part, I leave things as they are. I don't particularly like to use dry cleaners.
Great. Okay. So that is it for this evening. Now, for those of you attending, if you would like a copy of the chat from tonight, send us an email. Our email is genealogy@acpl.info. But if we did not get to your question this evening, like I said, feel free to send Melissa an email. She's a wonderful resource, and we really appreciate your program this evening.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for having me.
All right. So thanks again, everybody. Thank you, Melissa, and I hope all of you have a lovely evening. Bye.
Bye.